The harsh crack of the gavel slices through the charged air of the makeshift courtroom, a sound as final as a nail in a coffin. Dust motes dance in the slivers of sunlight, piercing the grimy windows of the town hall, illuminating the grim faces turned towards the front. Order, order in this court. Sheriff Brody's voice is a gravelly rasp, trying to quell the rising murmur from the packed benches. Before him, a young woman stands ramrod straight, though a tremor runs through her slender frame, visible even beneath the worn fabric of her dress. Her hands are clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white. This is Elara Vance. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, are fixed on the man who presides not from a judge's bench, but from a sturdy oak table commandeered for the occasion. Augustus Blackwood, the town's banker, mayor, and largest landowner, his expression a mask of stern civic duty. It is his cattle she is accused of stealing. Based on the evidence presented, Blackwood announces, his voice smooth and resonant, carrying an undeniable weight of authority, and the testimony of trusted citizens, this informal counsel finds Elara Vance. He pauses, letting the silence stretch, every eye in the room now on him, then on her. Elara doesn't flinch, but her breath catches. Guilty of cattle rustling, a gasp ripples through the crowd, quickly followed by satisfied nods and dark mutterings of "serves her right" and "string her up." She's an outsider, new to Redemption Gulch, with no family to speak for her, no connections to soften the blow of frontier justice. Blackwood continues, his gaze sweeping over the assembly before settling coolly on Elara. The penalty for such a crime is severe. Given the losses local ranchers have endured, an example must be made. His words hang, heavy with implied threat, jail or worse. The nearest circuit judge is weeks away, and in towns like Redemption Gulch, local justice, especially when driven by a powerful man like Blackwood, is often swift and brutal. The banker is the law here, in all but name. Danger's close and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. As Sheriff Brody moves to take Elara's arm, a figure detaches himself from the shadowed rear wall of the hall. Caleb Thorne, a rancher whose own spread bordered Blackwood's, steps forward. His face is weathered, his eyes narrowed in thought. He's a man of few words, known for his quiet integrity and for minding his own affairs. But he's also known loss, his own small herd depleted by rustlers more than once. Hold on, Sheriff. Caleb's voice is low, but it cuts through the lingering buzz. Something about this, it don't sit right. All heads turn. Blackwood's eyes, chips of cold obsidian, fix on Caleb. A challenge, however quiet, has been issued. And with that unexpected intervention, the fate of Elara Vance, already seemingly sealed, suddenly hung in a precarious new balance. The accusation had fallen upon Elara Vance like a hawk upon a dove. Only a fortnight she'd been in Redemption Gulch, having arrived on the stagecoach with little more than a carpet bag and a quiet hope for a fresh start as a seamstress. She'd found meager lodging in a room above the Mercantile, its window overlooking the dusty main street, and, further out, the vast, rolling plains that were both the lifeblood and the peril of this frontier territory. The trouble started when 3 of Augustus Blackwood's prize steers went missing from his north pasture, the one that lay inconveniently close to the small, overgrown track. Elara had been seen walking along on more than one occasion, gathering wild herbs. It was circumstantial, flimsy as a spider's web, yet in a town already agitated by a recent spate of rustling, suspicion needed little to take root, especially when fanned by the right whispers. Sheriff Brody, a man more comfortable with a brawl than a careful investigation, had found a discarded calfskin glove near a break in Blackwood's fence line, a woman's glove, small and somewhat worn. Someone recalled seeing Elara mending a similar pair. Then, a partial footprint, indistinct in the dry earth, was declared to be hers by a townsman eager to curry favor with Blackwood. It was enough. She was hauled from her room, her protests of innocence swallowed by the rising tide of accusation, orchestrated with subtle precision by Blackwood himself, who played the part of the aggrieved victim with convincing solemnity. Caleb Thorne had watched the proceedings in the town hall with a growing unease. He'd lost cattle himself, more than any other small rancher in the valley, and the frustration was a bitter taste in his mouth. But Ilara Vance, she didn't look like any rustler he'd ever imagined. There was a hunted look in her eyes, yes, but beneath it, a resilience that didn't speak of hardened criminality. She was slight, almost fragile-looking, and the idea of her single-handedly driving off 3 steers over rough country in the dead of night stretched his credulity. He knew Blackwood, too. Knew the man's ambition, his smooth charm that could turn to ice, his uncanny knack for acquiring land and influence. Blackwood was a pillar of Redemption Gulch, his bank holding the notes on half the businesses and ranches in the county, including a sizable one on Caleb's own struggling operation. To question Blackwood was to risk his ire, and few dared. The town itself, Redemption Gulch, was a hard-scrabble collection of clapboard buildings baking under the relentless sun, a place where fortunes were sought but rarely found by the common man. It was a community bound by shared hardship, but also quick to judge, particularly outsiders. Suspicion was a currency traded as readily as coin, and fear, especially the fear of losing what little one had, made people eager for a scapegoat. When Caleb Thorne spoke up, a hush fell. It wasn't just the words, but who spoke them. Thorne was respected, if not always liked, for his stubborn independence. Augustus Blackwood's displeasure was a palpable thing, a chill that radiated from his impeccably dressed figure. He favored dark, well-cut suits, even in the oppressive heat, his silver-topped cane a constant accessory. After Caleb's interruption, Blackwood had given a curt nod to the sheriff. Perhaps Mr. Thorne has information he neglected to share earlier. The banker's voice was silk-smooth, but the underlying challenge was clear. Later, as Ilara was led to the small, stifling cell at the back of the sheriff's office, Caleb saw Blackwood speaking quietly with 2 of his ranch hands, men known more for their brawn than their intellect. Their eyes followed Caleb as he left the town hall, and he knew he'd marked himself. The jail cell was a cramped, airless box. A single high window, barred and dusty, offered a sliver of sky. Ilara sank onto the hard cot, the finality of her situation crashing down. She had been so careful, so determined to build a new life, to leave the shadows of her past behind, and now this. She pressed her face into the thin, rough blanket, fighting back the tears of despair and injustice. Later, as dusk began to purple the sliver of sky, Sheriff Brody brought her a plate of beans and a tin cup of water. He wasn't a cruel man, Caleb thought, just a man easily led and overwhelmed by the complexities of true justice when a powerful voice dictated otherwise. He'd seen Brody look at Ilara with a flicker of something like pity, quickly masked. Caleb lingered outside the sheriff's office, the weight of his own doubts pressing down. He remembered the tracks he'd seen himself, days before Blackwood reported his steers missing, further north than the banker's pasture, leading towards the broken country near Devil's Canyon, tracks of several shod horses moving fast, and the faint, scuffed signs of driven cattle. They hadn't looked like the work of a lone woman on foot. That evening, Caleb made his way to the mercantile, ostensibly for some sackcloth. Mrs. Triplevaste Henderson, the proprietor, a woman whose sharp eyes missed little, was sweeping the porch. "Heard you spoke up for that Vance girl," she said, not looking at him. "Bold move, Caleb. Blackwood ain't one to be crossed." "Just want to see justice done, Martha," Caleb replied, his voice even. "Justice," she snorted softly. "Round here, justice often wears the banker's spectacles." She paused, then added, "She bought thread from me, day before they took her. Blue thread. Said she was mending a dress for Sunday. Didn't seem like someone planning a cattle raid. A small detail, perhaps, but it lodged in Caleb's mind. The woman in that cell, carefully choosing thread, didn't fit the image of a desperate rustler. The awkwardness of her situation, her palpable fear, mixed with that quiet dignity he'd seen, pulled at something in him. He knew what it was to be alone, to fight for what was yours against long odds. His own ranch was a testament to that struggle, the quiet evenings often filled with the solitary calculation of dwindling resources against mounting debts, many of them owed to Blackwood's bank. The next morning, Caleb approached Sheriff Brody. "Sheriff, I'd like to talk to the prisoner." Brody grunted, scratching his jaw. "What for, Thorne? She's guilty. Blackwood says so." "Maybe," Caleb said, his gaze steady. "But I saw some tracks a few days back. north of here. Didn't look like her work. Looked professional. Might be worth asking her if she saw anything, being out walking like she was. Brody hesitated. Blackwood's influence was strong, but Thorne was a respected citizen, and his suggestion, on the surface, seemed reasonable. All right, Thorne, 5 minutes. But don't go filling her head with false hope. The cell was even more oppressive in the daylight. Elara looked up as Caleb entered, her eyes wary, shadowed with sleeplessness. He pulled up a crate Brody had grudgingly provided. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice gentler than he intended. "I'm Caleb Thorne. I run a ranch east of here." She just nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "The sheriff tells me you were often out walking near Blackwood's north pasture." "I was gathering herbs," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "for remedies, and sometimes just to be out of that small room." "Did you ever see anyone else out there? Anyone suspicious? Riders you didn't recognize?" Elara frowned, concentrating. "A few times. I saw riders. Distant. They never came close. 2 or 3, I think, on dark horses. They were always moving fast, towards the canyons." "Can you describe them?" She shook her head. "Too far. And I tend to keep to myself. I didn't want to draw attention." Her gaze dropped. "It seems I did anyway." Caleb felt a pang of something akin to sympathy. He knew that instinct, the desire to be invisible when you felt vulnerable. "These riders," he pressed, "did you happen to notice anything about their horses, their gear, anything at all?" She thought for a long moment, her brow furrowed. One of the horses, it had a strange gait, a slight limp in the right foreleg, but only when it trotted. When it galloped, it seemed fine. Caleb's eyes sharpened. He'd seen a horse like that once, belonging to a shifty character who'd passed through town a year ago, a man rumored to have connections to organized rustling gangs up north. "Anything else, Miss Vance? Anything about the cattle? Did you ever get close enough to see the brands?" "No," she said. "Mr. Blackwood's cattle have his AB brand, don't they? I never saw any loose stock with that brand. Only his herd, safe in his pasture." She paused, then added, a flicker of defiance in her eyes, "I wouldn't steal. Not from him, not from anyone." Her quiet sincerity struck Caleb. It wasn't the bluster of a practiced liar, nor the panicked denial of the truly guilty caught in the act. It was something else. He believed her. Or at least, he believed she was innocent. The detail about the limping horse was specific, too specific to be a quick invention. It was a small thing, but it was something. As he left, he saw the hope that flickered in her eyes, quickly doused by fear. He knew then he couldn't just let this go. His own sense of justice, buried deep beneath layers of pragmatic survival, was stirring. He had to know the truth, not just for her, but for himself, for every small rancher who lived under the shadow of both rustlers and the kind of power Blackwood wielded. Caleb decided to ride out to the area Elara had described, near Blackwood's north pasture, but angling towards the rough country leading to Devil's Canyon. He told himself it was just to satisfy his own curiosity, to lay his doubts to rest. The sun beat down, the air thick with the scent of dust and dry grass. He cut for sign, his eyes scanning the ground with the practiced skill of a man who lived by the land. It took hours. The earth was hard-baked, ungenerous with its secrets. But then, in a shallow draw, sheltered from the worst of the wind, he found them. Faint, almost obliterated tracks of several shod horses and the telltale scuffs of cattle being driven hard. Just as she'd said, and among the horse tracks, he found one set that, every few yards in the softer patches, showed the slightest unevenness in the impression of the right forehoof. The limping horse. He followed the trail further, deeper into the broken land. It was clear these weren't amateurs. They knew how to move cattle quietly and quickly, using the terrain to their advantage. The trail eventually led to a narrow rocky pass that was a known route for those wishing to avoid the main trails and the law. It was heading away from Blackwood's main holdings, but also away from any direction that would implicate Elara. As he rode back towards town, his mind worked. Elara's observation about the limping horse, now corroborated, was a significant piece. But it wasn't enough to sway a town convinced of her guilt, not against Blackwood's influence. He needed more. He thought about who might own such a horse, or who might know the men Elara saw. These were not local rustlers he was beginning to suspect, but a more organized outfit. His investigation, quiet as he tried to keep it, did not go unnoticed. One evening, as he was leaving the livery after tending to his horse, two of Blackwood's men, the same ones he'd seen the banker talking to after the trial, stepped out of the shadows. Jed and Shorty, they weren't smiling. "Thorne," Jed drawled, blocking his path. "Heard you been poking around where you ain't welcome." "Just riding my own range," Caleb said, his voice level, his hand resting near the Colt at his hip. Shorty, a squat man with mean little eyes, chuckled. "Your range is getting mighty close to Mr. Blackwood's business these days. He don't like folks sniffing around his business." "And I don't like seeing an innocent woman railroaded," Caleb retorted, his patience wearing thin. Jed's eyes narrowed. "She's a thief. Everyone knows it. Best you remember who your friends are, Thorne. Mr. Blackwood can be a good friend or a powerful enemy." The threat hung in the air, thick and unpleasant. Caleb met Jed's gaze. "I reckon I know who my friends are. And they ain't men who threaten folks in dark alleys." He stepped around them, expecting a blow, but they let him pass, their eyes boring into his back. The message was clear: drop it. This only solidified Caleb's resolve. If Blackwood was using his men to deliver warnings, he was worried. Caleb decided his next step was to talk to other ranchers, subtly, to see if anyone else had noticed anything unusual, or had perhaps suffered losses they hadn't reported for fear of drawing the rustlers' attention, or worse, Blackwood's. He started with old man Hemlock, whose small spread was furthest up the valley, bordering the wild lands. Hemlock was a recluse, soured on town life, but he knew the range like the back of his hand. It took some doing to get Hemlock to talk. Caleb found him mending a fence line, his weathered face skeptical. But when Caleb mentioned the limping horse, Hemlock's eyes showed a flicker of interest. "Aye," Hemlock rasped, spitting tobacco juice. "Seen a horse like that. Part of a crew passed through about a month back. Hard-looking outfit. Headed north they were. Asked for water, didn't say much else. Didn't like the look of 'em." "Did they have cattle with them?" Caleb asked. Hemlock shook his head. "Not then, but they were scouting, I reckon. One of 'em, the leader, mean-faced fellow with a scar on his cheek, he asked a lot of questions about Blackwood's herds. How many head where they grazed, how many hands Blackwood employed." This was more than Caleb had hoped for. A known gang casing Blackwood's operation. But why would they steal only 3 steers and make it look like a novice job, easily pinned on someone like Ilara? It didn't add up unless the theft itself was a distraction, or unless Blackwood himself was involved in something far deeper. The thought was outlandish, yet it began to take root in Caleb's mind. Blackwood was expanding rapidly, buying up distressed properties. Where was all that capital coming from? His bank was prosperous, but was it that prosperous? Caleb visited Ilara again. He told her about the tracks, about Hemlock's information. A fragile hope bloomed in her eyes. "So, you believe me," she whispered. "I believe you didn't steal those cattle," Caleb said, "but proving it is another matter. Blackwood has this town in his pocket." He looked at her, seeing the toll the jail and the uncertainty were taking. Her face was paler, thinner. "We need something concrete, Miss Vance, something that points directly away from you, and preferably towards who is responsible." "Ilara," she said softly. "Please, call me Ilara." "Ilara," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "This gang Hemlock saw, if they were professionals, they wouldn't be sloppy. That glove, the footprint, it feels too convenient." She nodded. "The glove, it was an old pair. I'd left them on the windowsill in my room to air out. Anyone could have taken them from the alley below." Another piece. The evidence against her was looking increasingly manufactured. Caleb began to suspect that the 3 steers were a deliberate, small-scale theft, designed specifically to frame Ilara. But why? What threat did a lone seamstress pose to Augustus Blackwood? Or was she simply a convenient pawn in a larger game? The pressure on Caleb mounted. His inquiries, however discreet, were noted. Shopkeepers became less talkative, old acquaintances suddenly too busy to pass the time of day. He received a polite but firm letter from Blackwood's bank, reminding him of an upcoming payment on his loan, a payment he knew he would struggle to meet. It was a veiled threat, a reminder of Blackwood's power. Fear began to gnaw at him, not for his own safety, but for his ranch, the only thing his father had left him, the land he'd poured his sweat and blood into. To lose it now. He shared his growing suspicions about Blackwood's possible involvement with Elara. She listened intently, her initial shock giving way to a grim understanding. "He wants something I have, or something I know," she murmured, more to herself than to Caleb. But what could that be? Then her eyes widened. "My father, before he died, he was a land surveyor. He worked all over this territory. He kept detailed journals, maps. I have them. They're in my trunk at the mercantile." "What kind of maps, Elara?" Caleb asked, a new urgency in his voice. "Maps of unclaimed land, mineral rights, water sources. He always said knowledge of the land was true wealth. He was working on a comprehensive survey of this entire valley when he took ill." She looked at Caleb, a dawning realization in her eyes. Could Blackwood want those journals? It was possible, if her father had charted valuable resources that Blackwood didn't know about, or if he'd discovered something that could challenge Blackwood's existing land claims. Caleb knew Blackwood was trying to consolidate all the best grazing and water rights in the valley. "We need to get those journals, Elara. They might hold the key." But getting into her room at the mercantile, with her reputation ruined and Blackwood's eyes seemingly everywhere, would be risky. He also knew he couldn't keep her in that cell indefinitely. The circuit judge was due in another week or so. If they didn't have solid proof by then, Elara would be formally tried and likely convicted. Caleb began to watch Blackwood more closely. He observed the banker's routines, the late nights he spent in his office at the bank, the discreet visitors who sometimes arrived after dark. He noticed that Blackwood made regular trips out to a supposedly abandoned line shack on the far edge of his property, near the rough country bordering Devil's Canyon. It was an odd destination for a man of Blackwood's stature. One evening, fueled by a desperate hunch, Caleb decided to risk a closer look at that line shack. He rode a long, circuitous route, avoiding main trails, and approached the shack under the cover of darkness. He tethered his horse well back in a grove of cottonwoods and crept forward on foot. The shack was dark, but he could smell the faint, acrid scent of recently burned branding fires. And then he saw it, a small, newly constructed corral hidden behind the shack, invisible from any distance. Inside, huddled together, were at least a dozen head of cattle. He moved closer, heart pounding. By the faint moonlight, he could just make out the brands. Some were familiar local brands: Miller's M Connected, Peterson's Lazy P, brands of ranchers who had recently reported losses. And then he saw one clear as day, his own CJ brand. His missing steers. Anger, cold and hard, rose in him. Blackwood wasn't just framing Elara. He was the rustler himself, or at least the orchestrator, using his position and influence to systematically plunder his neighbors, likely altering brands in this secluded spot before moving the cattle on. The 3 steers taken from his own pasture, the ones Elara was accused of stealing, were probably a deliberate plant, a way to create a scapegoat and divert suspicion. But how to prove it? Getting close enough to Blackwood's operation to find ledgers or witnesses seemed impossible. He needed more than just his word against the town's most powerful man. He thought of Elara's father's journals. If they contained information that threatened Blackwood's land grab, it would provide a powerful motive for framing her, for silencing her or driving her out. The next day, Caleb formulated a risky plan. He needed to get into Elara's room and retrieve those journals. He also needed to create a diversion, something to draw Blackwood's attention. He sought out Mrs. Henderson at the mercantile. He'd always found her to be a fair woman, despite her sharp tongue. "Martha," he said, keeping his voice low, "I need your help. I believe Elara Vance is innocent. And I think her father's papers, in her room, might prove it, or at least point to why Blackwood wants her out of the way." Mrs. Henderson looked at him, her gaze shrewd. "You're asking me to go against Augustus Blackwood, Caleb. That's a tall order." "I know, but it's the right thing to do." He told her about the line shack, the altered brands, his own stolen cattle. He didn't mention Elara's father's journals specifically, just that her papers might contain evidence. The storekeeper was silent for a long moment, her fingers drumming on the counter. "That girl," she said finally, "she's got good eyes, honest eyes. And Blackwood, he's gotten too big for his britches, too greedy." she sighed. "All right, Thorne, I'll help you. But if this goes sour, I never saw you." The plan was simple and dangerous. Mrs. Henderson would arrange for a small, smoky fire in the back storeroom of the Mercantile. Nothing damaging, just enough to cause a commotion and draw people, including Sheriff Brody and hopefully Blackwood, if he was in town. During the confusion, Caleb would slip upstairs to Ilara's room. The following afternoon, as the town drowsed in the midday heat, a shout of "Fire!" went up from the Mercantile. Smoke, thick and acrid, began to billow from a rear window. People came running. Sheriff Brody, alerted by the commotion, lumbered towards the scene. Caleb, positioned across the street, saw his chance. As the crowd converged on the front of the Mercantile, he slipped around the back, up the rickety external stairs to the second floor, and let himself into Ilara's small room using a key Mrs. Henderson had found. The room was just as Ilara had left it, a sense of hurried departure lingering in the air. Her small trunk was under the narrow bed. He pulled it out, his fingers fumbling with the latch. Inside, beneath neatly folded clothes, were several oilskin-wrapped bundles. He grabbed them, his heart hammering against his ribs. Just as he was about to leave, he heard footsteps on the stairs. He froze. It wasn't the heavy tread of the sheriff. It was lighter, more purposeful. He peered through a crack in the door. It was one of Blackwood's men, Jed, the one who had threatened him. He must have been watching the Mercantile, or perhaps Blackwood, ever cautious, had his own suspicions about Ilara's belongings. There was no time to escape back down the stairs. Caleb quickly scanned the room. The only other way out was the window overlooking the alley. It was a 12-foot drop, but better than a confrontation with Jed. He tucked the journals inside his shirt, unlatched the window, and swung himself out, landing hard in the alley, the impact jarring his teeth. He heard Jed kick open the door to Ilara's room above him. Not waiting, Caleb scrambled to his feet and sprinted down the alley, disappearing before Jed could look out. Back in the relative safety of his own sparsely furnished ranch house, Caleb unwrapped the oilskin packets. They were indeed journals and hand-drawn maps, meticulously detailed. He spread them out on his rough-hewn table. It took him hours, tracing lines, deciphering notes written in a precise, spidery hand. Much of it was standard survey data. But then he found it, a detailed map of the valley, and on it, Ilara's father had marked a significant underground spring in a section of land Blackwood had recently acquired from a rancher who'd gone bust. Water was life in this arid country, and a hidden spring of that magnitude would make the land immensely valuable, far more than Blackwood had likely paid for it. More damningly, there were notes in a journal entry detailing discrepancies in some of Blackwood's older land claims, suggestions of moved boundary markers and falsified survey records that, if proven, could invalidate Blackwood's ownership of key parcels. Ilara Vance, possessor of these journals, was not just a convenient scapegoat, she was a direct threat to Blackwood's empire. Caleb now had motive. He had his own observations at the line shack. He had Ilara's testimony about the riders and the limping horse, and Hemlock's corroboration. It was a strong case, but Blackwood was entrenched, his influence woven into the very fabric of Redemption Gulch. A direct confrontation could be disastrous if not handled perfectly. The circuit judge, Judge Potter, was due to arrive in 3 days. That was their deadline. He went to see Ilara, sharing his findings. The relief in her face was profound, but fear still lingered. "He won't just let this happen, Caleb. He's dangerous." "I know," Caleb said, "which is why we need to be smart about this. Judge Potter is known for being a fair man, but he'll need undeniable proof." They decided their best chance was to lay a trap, to catch Blackwood's men in the act of moving the stolen, rebranded cattle from the line shack. If they could present Judge Potter with fresh evidence and live culprits, Blackwood's denials would crumble. It was risky. Blackwood's crew was armed and ruthless. Caleb knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed the sheriff, but Brody was still very much under Blackwood's thumb. He had to somehow force Brody's hand or bypass him. Caleb thought of young Deputy Miles, a recent arrival, earnest and less jaded than Brody. Miles had seemed troubled by Ilara's summary conviction. Caleb approached him cautiously, laying out what he knew, showing him a tracing of one of the altered brands he'd seen at the line shack. Miles listened, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to a dawning horror. If this is true, Mr. Thorne, Mr. Blackwood, he's the biggest thief of all. He is, Caleb confirmed, and he's using Ilara Vance to cover his tracks. Will you help us bring this to Judge Potter? We need to catch his men moving those cattle. Deputy Miles, after a moment of internal struggle, nodded. I took an oath, Mr. Thorne. I'll do what's right. The plan was set for the night before Judge Potter was due to arrive. Caleb had observed that Blackwood's men usually moved small batches of the rebranded cattle under the cover of a moonless night, heading towards a distant railhead where no questions were asked. He, Deputy Miles, and surprisingly, Mrs. Henderson, who insisted she could watch their backs and bring sandwiches, would lie in wait near the trail leading from Blackwood's line shack. Old Man Hemlock, when Caleb cautiously approached him again with more details, grumbled but agreed to create a diversion further up the valley if needed, something to draw away any of Blackwood's outriders. The night was black as pitch, the air still and heavy. Caleb, Miles, and Mrs. Henderson concealed themselves in a dense thicket of choke cherry bushes overlooking the narrow trail. Hours passed. The silence was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Caleb felt the tension coiling in his gut. So much depended on this. Ilara's freedom, his own ranch, the very soul of Redemption Gulch. Just after midnight they heard it, the soft thud of hooves, the lowing of cattle. A handful of riders materialized out of the darkness, herding about 20 head of steer. Caleb strained his eyes. In the faint starlight, he could see the lead rider was Jed, Blackwood's foreman. Now, Caleb whispered to Miles. Deputy Miles stepped onto the trail, lantern held high. Hold right there, in the name of the law. The riders pulled up sharply, confused, then angry. Jed's hand went to his gun. Well, looky here, deputy playing hero, and Thorne, sticking your nose where it ain't wanted again. These cattle are stolen, Jed, Caleb said, stepping out beside Miles, his own rifle leveled. And we know who you're working for. You got no proof, Jed sneered, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Oh, I think Judge Potter will find it interesting, Miles said, his voice gaining confidence, especially when we check the brands on these steers against the ones reported missing by Mr. Thorne, Mr. Peterson, and Mr. Miller. From the darkness behind the rustlers, Mrs. Prosson-Z.G. Henderson, armed with her late husband's scattergun, announced, and I reckon I saw you boys altering brands at that shack myself, clear as day, just last week. Funny how a body can see things when they're out berry picking. While not entirely true, her stern delivery was convincing. Jed and his men were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. They knew when a game was up. Grumbling, they dropped their gun belts. The next morning, Judge Potter arrived in Redemption Gulch to a scene of considerable excitement. Deputy Miles, with Caleb at his side, presented the captured rustlers and the recovered cattle. Ilara was brought from her cell, not as a prisoner, but as a key witness. In the same town hall where she had been condemned, she now stood before Judge Potter and recounted her story, her voice clear and steady. Caleb then laid out his evidence, the journals, the maps showing Blackwood's motive, his own discovery at the line shack, the testimony of Hemlock, who had grudgingly come to town, and the capture of Blackwood's men with the rebranded cattle. Augustus Blackwood, summoned before the judge, was a picture of outraged innocence. He blustered, he denied, he accused Caleb of a personal vendetta, but the evidence was overwhelming. Jed, facing a long prison sentence, finally broke and confessed, implicating Blackwood as the mastermind behind the rustling ring that had plagued the valley for over a year, using his bank to launder the money and his influence to deflect suspicion. The transformation in the courtroom was astounding. Faces that had been hard with accusation now looked at Ilara with dawning shame and respect. Augustus Blackwood, the pillar of the community, was revealed as a common thief, albeit on a grand scale. Judge Potter, a man of stern integrity, listened to all the testimony, his gaze missing nothing. His judgment was swift. Warrants were issued for Blackwood's arrest and the seizure of his assets pending a full investigation. Ilara Vance was formally exonerated, all charges dismissed. A quiet fell over the courtroom as the reality sank in. The man they had trusted, had feared, had allowed to rule their lives, was a criminal. Ilara felt a wave of dizziness, the release of tension so profound it almost buckled her knees. Caleb's hand found her arm, steadying her. Their eyes met, and in that shared look, there was a universe of understanding, of trials overcome, and a bond forged in adversity. Later that day, as Augustus Blackwood was led away in handcuffs by a U.S. Marshal summoned by Judge Potter, a strange quiet settled over Redemption Gulch. Some townsfolk approached Ilara, offering awkward apologies. Mrs. Henderson gave her a fierce hug and offered her permanent lodging, even a partnership in the mercantile if she wanted it. Ilara stood with Caleb on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the dust settle from the marshal's departure. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. "What will you do now?" Caleb asked softly. Ilara looked out at the vast expanse of the plains, no longer a place of fear but of possibility. "I think," she said, a small smile playing on her lips, "I might just stay. Perhaps there's a need for a good seamstress in Redemption Gulch, and someone to keep an eye on land claims." Caleb returned her smile. The shadow of Blackwood's debt no longer hung over his ranch. The journals, now lodged as evidence, had also revealed that his own father's original survey markers for his property had been subtly altered years ago by Blackwood's machinations, meaning Caleb actually owned more viable grazing land than he'd thought. "I reckon there is," he said. He looked at her, at the strength and integrity that had shone through even in her darkest hour. He had set out to find justice for a stranger, and in doing so, had found something more, a shared resilience, a quiet understanding that felt like the beginning of a new trail, one he wouldn't mind walking with a partner. The air was clear, the future uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt full of hope. He watched her turn her face to the breeze, a free woman, the accusation a fading scar, and knew that Redemption Gulch, in its own flawed way, had finally lived up to its name, at least for one deserving soul. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the western sky in fiery hues. Ilara Vance stands not as an accused, but as a woman who, with the help of a quiet rancher, reclaimed her name and her freedom. The town of Redemption Gulch is slowly coming to terms with the truth, learning that power doesn't always equate to righteousness. Caleb Thorne watches Ilara, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. They face down a powerful man and the weight of public opinion, and justice, though hard-won, has prevailed. Their journey was one of courage against corruption, and the unmasking of a thief who wore the guise of respectability. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.